The dust from the trail still clung to Lucas Everett's boots as he trudged up the hill toward the small cemetery that overlooked his ranch. His shoulders, normally squared and strong, sagged beneath the weight of grief that had become his constant companion over the past year. The setting sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming territory, painting the grasslands in hues of amber and gold as summer gave way to autumn in 1876. He wasn't expecting company at his daughter's grave. Most folks in Whispering Pines gave him a wide berth these days, unsure how to approach a man who had lost both wife and child within the span of 3 cruel months. But there she was, a woman with honey-brown hair falling in loose waves down her back, kneeling beside Emma's small headstone, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Lucas froze. For a moment, he considered turning back, allowing this stranger her privacy. But this was his daughter's resting place, and curiosity mingled with his natural protectiveness. He approached quietly, boots crunching on the dry grass. The woman didn't hear him until he was nearly upon her. She startled, turning quickly to reveal tear-stained cheeks and eyes the color of spring sage. She scrambled to her feet, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. "I'm sorry," she stammered, wiping at her face with her free hand. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'll go." "Wait," Lucas said, his voice rough from disuse. "You knew Emma?" The woman's gaze dropped to the small grave, marked with a wooden cross that Lucas had carved himself. Fresh wildflowers, not the ones in the woman's hand, already rested against the stone. Someone had been tending his daughter's grave when he couldn't bear to visit. She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "Yes, I was her teacher in town, Miss Lydia Dawson." Lucas nodded slowly, recognition dawning. "Miss Dawson, Emma spoke of you often." A small, sad smile touched Lydia's lips. She was a special child, so bright and full of life. Lucas swallowed hard against the knot in his throat. That she was. He gestured to the flowers at the grave. "You've been coming here." It wasn't a question, but Lydia nodded anyway. "Every Sunday after church. I hope that's all right." Lucas couldn't remember the last time he'd been to church, probably Emma's funeral. His faith had died alongside his family, but something about this woman's genuine grief touched him. "She'd want you here with us," he said quietly, surprising himself with the words. Lydia looked up sharply, as if trying to determine if he was being genuine or merely polite. Whatever she saw in his face must have reassured her, because she nodded and knelt back down beside the grave. Lucas joined her, his knees pressing into the earth that held his greatest treasure. Together, they sat in silence as the sun continued its descent behind the mountains. "I brought her favorite," Lydia said finally, placing her bouquet of blue cornflowers beside the others. She used to pick these during recess and weave them into little crowns. Lucas hadn't known that. The realization that this woman might possess memories of his daughter that he did not send a strange sensation through his chest, part jealousy, part desperate hunger to hear more. "Tell me," he said simply. Lydia looked at him, uncertainty crossing her features. "Are you sure?" "Please." The word came out more broken than he intended. So as darkness fell around them, Lydia Dawson told Lucas Everett about how his 8-year-old daughter had organized reading circles among her classmates, how she'd stood up to boys twice her size when they teased the younger children, and how she'd once smuggled an injured baby rabbit into the schoolhouse, hiding it in her desk until Lydia discovered it chewing on arithmetic papers. Lucas found himself chuckling at that last story, the sound foreign to his ears after so many months of silence. "She had her mother's heart," he said softly. "Sarah never could resist a creature in need either." "I'm sorry," Lydia said. "I never had the chance to meet your wife." Lucas nodded. Sarah had fallen ill during the harsh winter, before Emma started school that spring. By the time the snow thawed, his wife was gone, leaving him alone to raise their daughter. "She would have liked you," Lucas said, surprised to find he meant it. "Anyone who cared for Emma the way you did." They fell into silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. As the stars began to appear in the vast Wyoming sky, Lucas realized it was the longest conversation he'd had with anyone in months. "It's getting late," Lydia said finally. "I should get back to town before it's fully dark." Lucas glanced at the deepening shadows. "Did you ride out here alone?" Lydia nodded. "I have a mare hitched down by the road." "I'll walk you down," Lucas said, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. She hesitated briefly before taking it, allowing him to help her up. Her hand was smaller than he expected, but her grip was firm. As they walked down the hill together, Lucas felt something stir inside him, not happiness exactly, but perhaps the first faint whisper that happiness might someday be possible again. "Will you come again next Sunday?" he asked as they reached her horse. Lydia paused in the midst of untying the reins. "Would you mind?" "No," Lucas said honestly. I think it might be good to remember her together." Lydia smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes despite the sadness they still held. "Then I'll be here." Lucas watched as she mounted her mare with practiced ease. Another surprise, the schoolteacher was clearly comfortable on horseback. "Be careful on the ride back," he called as she turned toward town. "Always am," she replied, then added hesitantly, "Perhaps next time you might share some of your stories about Emma too?" Lucas felt his throat tighten. "Perhaps," he managed. With a nod, Lydia urged her horse forward, soon disappearing into the gathering darkness. Lucas stood watching long after she had gone, feeling as though something important had just happened, though he couldn't quite name what it was. The week that followed moved with an unfamiliar rhythm for Lucas. The daily tasks of ranching hadn't changed. Cattle still needed tending, fences still needed mending, and the small crew of cowhands he employed still looked to him for direction. But for the first time in a year, he found himself looking forward to something. Sunday. When the day finally arrived, Lucas woke before dawn, as was his custom. But instead of immediately heading out to check the herd, he found himself standing before the small mirror in his bedroom, razor in hand, contemplating the wild beard that had grown unchecked for months. An hour later, clean-shaven and dressed in his least-worn shirt, Lucas rode up to the cemetery carrying a small bundle of wildflowers he'd gathered along the way. He was early. The church service in town wouldn't be finished for another hour at least, but he wanted some time alone with Emma before Lydia arrived. "Morning, little one," he said softly as he approached the grave. "I brought you some pretties. He arranged the flowers carefully beside the marker, then sat down on the ground, letting his hand rest on the earth that covered his daughter. "I met your teacher last week," he continued, finding comfort in speaking aloud, though no one was there to hear. "Miss Dawson. You were right about her. She's nice, just like you said." The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "I think she misses you nearly as much as I do," Lucas said. "It's strange to think about how many lives you touched in your short time here, how many hearts you found your way into." He talked to Emma for a while longer, telling her about the new foal born in the stable, and how the apple trees behind the house were heavy with fruit that would soon be ready for picking. Emma had loved helping with the harvest, her small hands carefully placing each apple in the basket while munching on one that was too bruised to save Papa. Lucas was so lost in memory that he didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until Lydia's voice called a gentle greeting. "Mr. Everett? I hope I'm not interrupting?" Lucas turned to see her dismounting from her mare. She wore a simple blue dress today, with her hair pinned up beneath a modest hat. She looked every inch the proper schoolteacher, yet there was something undeniably spirited about her that transcended her tidy appearance. "Not at all," Lucas said, rising to his feet. "And please, call me Lucas." "Lucas," she repeated with a small smile. Then, with a touch of surprise in her voice, "You've shaved." Lucas's hand went self-consciously to his now smooth jaw. "Thought it was about time. Wasn't much good at looking after myself this past year." Lydia's expression softened. "Grief has its own timeline. There's no right way to walk that path." The simple wisdom of her words struck Lucas deeply. Most people offered platitudes about time healing all wounds or Emma being in a better place. Lydia seemed to understand that grief wasn't something to be rushed through or brushed aside. She approached the grave, kneeling to place her own cornflowers again, along with some late-blooming daisies beside his. "How was the service?" Lucas asked, feeling awkward suddenly. "Reverend Johnson gave a fine sermon on rebuilding," Lydia said, though Mrs. Peterson's snoring during the closing prayer somewhat undermined the solemnity of the occasion. A surprised laugh escaped Lucas. Agnes Peterson could sleep through the second coming. "You know her well." "Everyone in Whispering Pines knows Agnes," Lucas said with a smile. "She delivered half the babies in the county, including Emma." "I didn't know she was a midwife," Lydia said. "Retired now, but she was the best. Saved Sarah's life when the birth got complicated." Lucas's smile faded slightly at the memory. "Emma was our miracle. Doctors told us Sarah likely couldn't bear children after a fall from a horse in her youth. Then, 7 years into our marriage, Emma came along." Lydia listened attentively, her eyes never leaving his face. "That explains why she was so precious to you both." "Every child is precious," Lucas said. "But yes, Emma was our unexpected blessing." They fell into conversation easily after that, sharing memories of Emma. Lucas told Lydia about Emma's first steps across the ranch house kitchen, her delight in helping with the spring calves, and her uncanny ability to find 4-leaf clovers in any patch of grass. "She brought me one on her first day of school," Lydia recalled. "Said it was to make sure I had good luck teaching her." "That sounds like Emma," Lucas said fondly. "Always thinking of others." As the afternoon wore on, their conversation gradually expanded beyond Emma. Lucas learned that Lydia had come west from Boston 3 years earlier, seeking adventure and independence after the death of her parents left her with few ties to the East. "My father was a professor," she explained. "He believed daughters should be educated the same as sons. When the school board here discovered I could teach Latin and higher mathematics as well as the usual subjects, they were willing to overlook my youth and inexperience." "How old are you?" Lucas asked, then immediately regretted the directness of the question. "Forgive me, that was impertinent," Lydia laughed, a warm sound that seemed to brighten the air around them. "I'm 25, Mr. Everett Lucas, ancient by spinsterhood standards back east, but apparently still shockingly young to be unchaperoned in Wyoming territory." "You seem to manage just fine," Lucas observed. "I do," she agreed, "though it hasn't been without challenges. When I first arrived, Mayor Thompson's wife made it her personal mission to find me a husband. I had to fend off 3 ranch hands, a shopkeeper, and the very married doctor before she finally accepted I wasn't interested." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Not looking to settle down." "Not looking to settle," Lydia corrected. "There's a difference. I came west for freedom and purpose. Marriage, in my experience, often requires women to sacrifice both." "Not all marriages," Lucas said quietly. Lydia's expression softened. "No, I don't suppose they do. Yours and Sarah's." "We were partners in everything," Lucas confirmed. "This ranch was her dream as much as mine. She could ride and rope as well as any man, and she never let anyone tell her what she couldn't do." "She sounds remarkable." She was. Lucas gazed out over the valley below, where his ranch house stood surrounded by pastures. "After she died, I think I've just been existing, going through the motions for Emma's sake. And then when Emma got sick—" He trailed off, the pain still too raw to articulate. Lydia reached out, her hand coming to rest lightly on his arm. "I can't imagine your loss, but Emma wouldn't want you just existing." Lucas looked down at her hand, small and pale against the sun-darkened skin of his forearm. The simple human contact sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "No," he agreed. "She wouldn't." They remained that way for a moment, connected by that light touch and the shared love of a child now gone. Then Lydia withdrew her hand, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I should be getting back," she said. "I have lessons to prepare for tomorrow." Lucas nodded, oddly disappointed that their time was ending. I'll walk you to your horse." As they made their way down the hill, Lucas found himself wondering if he should invite her to return the following Sunday. Before he could form the words, Lydia spoke. "Would it be too forward of me to ask if I might come again next week?" Relief washed over him. "Not forward at all. I'd like that." At her horse they paused, neither seemingly eager to part ways. "Thank you," Lucas said finally, "for remembering her, for helping me remember the joy and not just the loss." Lydia's smile was gentle. "Thank you for sharing her with me. Until next Sunday, then?" "Until Sunday," Lucas confirmed. He watched her ride away, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. The following Sunday established a pattern that would continue through the golden weeks of autumn. Lydia would attend church in town, then ride out to the cemetery where Lucas would be waiting. They would visit Emma's grave together, leaving flowers and sharing stories, then spend hours in conversation that ranged from books they'd read to their hopes for the territory's future. With each passing week, Lucas found himself looking forward to their meetings with increasing anticipation. He began shaving regularly again, tending to his appearance in a way he hadn't bothered with since losing his family. The ranch hands noticed the change, exchanging knowing glances when he rode out each Sunday afternoon, but they were wise enough not to comment directly. On the fifth Sunday of their meetings, dark clouds gathered on the horizon as Lucas waited at the cemetery. He frowned at the approaching storm, concerned that Lydia might get caught in it on a ride from town. He was about to saddle up and ride toward town to meet her when he spotted her mare cresting the hill. Lydia urged her horse forward as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. By the time she reached Lucas, the sprinkle had become a steady downpour. "This doesn't look like it's going to let up," Lucas shouted over the rain, helping her down from her horse. "We should get to the ranch house," Lydia nodded, already soaked to the skin despite her shawl. They hurried to Emma's grave, left their flowers, and then mounted their horses, making the short but wet ride down to the main house. The ranch house was modest, but solid, a two-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. Lucas helped Lydia dismount, and they rushed up the steps, taking shelter under the porch roof as the rain intensified. "Let me stable the horses," Lucas said. "Then we can get you dried off." "I can help," Lydia offered, but Lucas shook his head. "Go on inside and get warm. Doors unlocked." Lydia hesitated only briefly, before nodding and heading into the house while Lucas led the horses to the nearby stable. By the time he returned, drenched and shivering slightly, Lydia had found a towel in the kitchen and was attempting to dry her hair. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the towel. "I was dripping all over your floor." "Not at all," Lucas said, suddenly aware of the state of his home. While not exactly unkempt, the house bore the unmistakable signs of a widower's solitary existence. Dishes were stacked neatly but awaiting washing, books and papers were piled on every surface, and a fine layer of dust covered the mantel. I wasn't expecting company," he said awkwardly. Lydia smiled. "I grew up with 3 brothers, Lucas. This is positively immaculate by comparison." The casual mention of her family sparked Lucas's curiosity. Despite their many conversations, he realized how little he actually knew about Lydia's life before Wyoming. "You've never mentioned brothers before," he noted, taking off his wet coat and hanging it by the door. A shadow crossed Lydia's face. "2 died in the war, the youngest from tuberculosis just after I turned 20. "I'm sorry," Lucas said, recognizing the familiar pain of loss in her expression. Lydia nodded. "It was a long time ago now, but it's why I understand, at least a little, what you've been through. Loss changes us." The rain drummed against the roof, creating a cocoon of sound around them as they stood in the kitchen, both slightly damp and suddenly aware of the intimacy of their situation. Lydia was the first to break the silence. "Perhaps I should make us some tea while we wait out the storm." Lucas nodded, grateful for her practical suggestion. "That would be nice. The kettle's there on the stove." While Lydia busied herself with the tea, Lucas stoked the fire in the main room, trying to bring warmth back into the house. When he returned to the kitchen, he found Lydia examining a child's drawing pinned to the wall, a colorful, if somewhat abstract rendering of a horse and rider. "Emma's?" she asked softly. Lucas nodded. "From last spring. She was determined to draw Thundercloud. That was my gelding before he got too old for hard riding." Lydia smiled at the drawing. "She captured his spirit, I think." "She did at that," Lucas agreed, feeling the familiar pang of loss, but also a strange comfort in sharing this piece of Emma with someone who appreciated it. The kettle whistled, and Lydia prepared 2 cups of tea. They carried them to the main room, settling into chairs near the fire as the rain continued to fall in sheets outside. "It's a lovely home," Lydia said, glancing around at the simple but sturdy furnishings. "How long have you been here?" 10 years now, Lucas replied. "Sarah and I came west from Missouri right after we married. Started with just 20 acres and gradually added more as we could afford it. The house came later. We lived in a 1-room cabin for the first 3 years." "You built all this yourself?" "With these 2 hands," Lucas confirmed, a hint of pride in his voice. "Every log, every nail. Sarah helped with all of it, even the roofing. Folks thought I was crazy letting a woman up on the roof, but you couldn't tell Sarah Everett what she couldn't do." Lydia smiled over her teacup. "She sounds like someone I would have admired greatly." "She would have liked you too," Lucas said, realizing as he spoke that it was true. She had no patience for conventional thinking about what women should or shouldn't do. "A woman ahead of her time," Lydia observed. "In many ways," Lucas agreed. Then, curious, he asked, "What about you? Did you always want to be a teacher?" Lydia considered the question. "Not always. As a girl, I dreamed of becoming an explorer, discovering uncharted territories and having grand adventures." She laughed self-deprecatingly. "Then I discovered that most of the world was already mapped and women explorers were few and far between." "So you chose teaching instead?" "Education is its own kind of exploration," Lydia said thoughtfully. "Helping young minds discover new worlds through books and learning, it's not so different from what I imagined, and coming west was my compromise with adventure." "Brave of you to come alone," Lucas observed. Lydia shrugged. "Perhaps, or perhaps just stubborn. My aunt thought I was throwing my life away, leaving Boston society for wilderness and savages, as she put it." Lucas grimaced. "Your aunt sounds charming." That drew a genuine laugh from Lydia. She meant well in her way. She'd been widowed young and never remarried. I think she wanted me to have the security she felt she'd missed. "And you wanted freedom instead." "I wanted purpose," Lydia corrected gently. "Security without purpose seemed like a hollow existence." Lucas nodded, understanding completely. After losing Sarah and Emma, his ranch had provided security but no purpose. He'd been going through the motions, existing but not living. "What about now?" he asked. "Has teaching given you the purpose you were seeking?" Lydia's eyes softened. "Yes. Especially with children like Emma, who remind me why education matters, why helping shape young minds is perhaps the most important work anyone can do." The mention of Emma brought them back to the connection that had first drawn them together. For a moment they sat in companionable silence, listening to the rain and the crackling fire. "Would you like to see her room?" Lucas asked suddenly, surprised by his own suggestion. He hadn't entered Emma's bedroom since the day after her funeral, when he'd closed the door on her belongings, unable to face the evidence of her absence. Lydia's eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure?" Lucas wasn't sure, not entirely, but something told him it was time. "Yes, I think she'd want you to see it." They climbed the stairs together, Lucas leading the way to a door at the end of the hall. He hesitated with his hand on the knob, then took a deep breath and pushed it open. The room was exactly as Emma had left it, a small bed with a colorful quilt, a wooden chest for her clothes, a shelf of books and treasures, and a small desk where she did her school lessons. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by the gray light filtering through the curtained window. Lydia stepped inside reverently, her eyes taking in every detail. "It's lovely," she said softly. "So much of her personality is here." Lucas remained in the doorway, not quite ready to enter. "Sarah made the quilt," he said. "Finished it just before she got sick." Lydia moved to the bookshelf, running her fingers gently over the spines of well-loved books. "Treasure Island," she read. She was reading this in class before she fell ill. She was so far ahead of the other children. She loved stories about adventure, Lucas said, finding it easier to speak about Emma in this space than he had expected. She wanted to be a sea captain when she grew up, despite never having seen the ocean. "She told me that," Lydia said with a smile. "I brought maps to class one day to show her what the Pacific looked like. She was so excited she could barely sit still." Lucas felt his throat tighten at the image. "Thank you for that. For encouraging her dreams, however unlikely they might have seemed." "Nothing is unlikely when you're 8 years old," Lydia said. "The world is full of possibility." She continued her gentle exploration of the room, pausing at Emma's desk where a half-finished letter lay, preserved in time. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the paper. Lucas nodded, moving finally to join her at the desk. Lydia picked up the letter carefully, as if it might crumble in her hands. "Dear Papa," she read aloud, "Miss Dawson says I'm the best reader in class and that soon I will be ready for Mr. Dickens' books like the ones on your shelf. I am practicing hard so I can read them to you when you are tired from ranching." Lydia's voice broke slightly. Lucas felt tears prick at his eyes but didn't try to stop them. "She was always thinking of others," he said, "even at the end when she was so sick. She worried about me being alone." Lydia placed the letter back exactly as she had found it, then turned to Lucas. Without hesitation, she reached out and took his hand in hers. "She was extraordinary," she said simply, "and she would be so proud of you for the way you've carried on." Lucas looked down at their joined hands, then back at Lydia's face. In her eyes he saw no pity, only understanding and something warmer that he wasn't yet ready to name. "I haven't carried on very well," he admitted. "Not until recently." "Grief doesn't follow a schedule," Lydia said, echoing her words from weeks earlier. "You've honored Emma and Sarah by keeping their memory alive, by tending to this ranch they loved, by continuing to put one foot in front of the other, even when it seemed impossible." Lucas felt something release in his chest, a knot of guilt and grief that had been lodged there for too long. "Thank you," he said quietly, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. They left Emma's room together, Lucas closing the door behind them, but not, he realized, with the same sense of finality as before. Now it felt like closing a door on a room that might be opened again when the time was right. Back downstairs, they discovered that the rain had slackened to a gentle drizzle. The late afternoon light was beginning to fade, and Lucas realized with a start how much time had passed. "I should get you back to town before dark," he said. "The trails get treacherous after rain." Lydia nodded, though she seemed reluctant to leave. "Yes, I suppose that would be best." As Lucas saddled their horses, he found himself searching for a reason to see her before the following Sunday. "I need to come into town for supplies this week," he said casually. "Perhaps we might have dinner at the hotel restaurant one evening?" Lydia's face brightened. "I'd like that. Wednesday is my early day, classes dismiss at 3. "Wednesday it is then," Lucas agreed, feeling lighter than he had in months. He rode with her all the way back to town, unwilling to part company until necessary. At the small house near the schoolhouse where Lydia boarded, they said their goodbyes with a formality that belied the intimacy they had shared that afternoon. "Until Wednesday," Lydia said, her eyes holding his. "Until Wednesday," Lucas echoed, watching as she disappeared inside. The ride home was solitary but not lonely. For the first time since losing Emma, Lucas found himself looking forward to the days ahead. Wednesday couldn't come quickly enough for Lucas. He spent Tuesday in town on various errands, arranging to stay overnight at the small hotel rather than riding back to the ranch only to return the next day. He found himself passing by the schoolhouse during afternoon recess, pausing to watch Lydia supervising the children as they played. She stood tall and straight in a practical gray dress, her hair neatly pinned back, looking every inch the proper schoolteacher. Then one of the smaller children fell, and Lucas watched as Lydia immediately knelt in the dirt, unconcerned for her dress, to comfort the crying boy. The tenderness in her face as she examined his scraped knee made something catch in Lucas's chest. That evening at the hotel restaurant, Lucas arrived early, nervously straightening his best shirt and wondering if perhaps he should have brought flowers. Before he could decide, Lydia appeared in the doorway, looking flushed and lovely in a blue dress he hadn't seen before. "Am I late?" she asked, slightly breathless as she joined him at the table. "Not at all," Lucas assured her. "I was early. You look—" He hesitated, suddenly unsure of the appropriate compliment. "Very nice." A smile touched Lydia's lips. "Thank you. It's not often I have occasion to wear anything but my teaching clothes." "Well, it suits you," Lucas said, pulling out her chair. Their dinner conversation flowed easily, as it always did. Lucas found himself telling Lydia about his childhood in Missouri, his father's small farm, and his early dreams of having land of his own. "I left home at 16, he admitted, worked as a ranch hand all over the territory before saving enough to buy my first parcel." "That must have taken tremendous determination," Lydia observed. Lucas shrugged. "I knew what I wanted. When I met Sarah, she had the same vision land of our own, a place to build something lasting." "And you did," Lydia said softly. "What you've created at the Everett Ranch is remarkable." "It's been hard these past months," Lucas admitted, wondering if there was any point to continuing, with no one to leave it to. Lydia's expression grew serious. "The legacy isn't just in who inherits the land, Lucas. It's in how you live on it, what you build, the example you set. That matters too." Her words struck him deeply, offering a perspective he hadn't considered. "You're a wise woman, Lydia Dawson." "Not wise," she demurred, "just stubborn enough to believe that what we do matters, even when the future isn't clear." After dinner, Lucas walked Lydia back to her boarding house, their pace deliberately slow, despite the autumn chill in the air. "Thank you for tonight," Lydia said as they reached her door. It was a welcome change from marking arithmetic papers. "Thank you for joining me," Lucas replied. "Would it be too forward to ask if we might do this again? Perhaps Saturday?" Lydia's smile was answer enough, but she added, "I'd like that very much." For a moment they stood facing each other in the gathering darkness. Lucas found himself wanting to reach for her hand, to pull her closer, but uncertainty held him back. It had been so long since he'd courted anyone, and the rules seemed foreign and forgotten. Lydia solved his dilemma by reaching out herself, laying her hand gently on his arm. "Good night, Lucas," she said softly. "Good night, Lydia," he replied, covering her hand briefly with his own before she withdrew and disappeared inside. Lucas walked back to the hotel with a lightness in his step that had been absent for too long. Something was beginning between them, something unexpected, but increasingly precious. Over the following weeks, their meetings expanded beyond Sunday afternoons at Emma's grave. Lucas found reasons to be in town several times a week, and Lydia began riding out to the ranch on Saturday afternoons when the weather permitted. They established a comfortable routine, sharing meals, conversations, and gradually more of themselves. As November arrived with its shorter days and biting winds, Lucas realized that Lydia had become essential to his life in a way he hadn't thought possible after losing Sarah and Emma. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. One Saturday afternoon, as they sat by the fire in his ranch house, Lucas finally voiced the fear that had been growing alongside his feelings for Lydia. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm betraying them," he said quietly, "by being happy again." Lydia set aside the book she had been reading to look at him intently. "Do you truly believe Sarah would want you to mourn forever?" Lucas considered the question honestly. "No," he admitted. "She was always practical that way. Once, when she had a close call during a difficult calving, she made me promise not to waste away in grief if anything happened to her. He smiled sadly at the memory. She said life was too precious for that. She was right, Lydia said gently. And Emma? Would she want you to be alone? The answer came easier than Lucas expected. No. She was always trying to make people happy. She'd hate to think of me being sad forever. Lydia moved from her chair to sit beside him on the sofa, taking his hand in hers. Then perhaps finding happiness again isn't betrayal at all. Perhaps it's the greatest honor you could give them living fully, as they would want you to. Lucas looked down at their joined hands, then up at Lydia's face. When did you get so wise? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. I had good teachers, she replied with a small smile. Including a remarkable 8-year-old girl who taught me more about joy in 6 months than most people learn in a lifetime. Without overthinking, Lucas leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and over almost as soon as it began. He pulled back, suddenly uncertain. I'm sorry, he began. I shouldn't have... But Lydia was already shaking her head, a flush spreading across her cheeks. Don't apologize, she said softly. Not unless you didn't mean it. I meant it, Lucas assured her. It's been a long time. For me too, Lydia admitted. She hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. I've never courted anyone seriously before. There was never anyone who seemed worth the compromise. Lucas felt a surge of both surprise and tenderness. And now? Lydia met his gaze steadily. Now I'm beginning to think that the right partnership isn't a compromise at all. This time, when they kissed, there was no hesitation on either side. Lucas drew her closer, one hand cupping her cheek, while the other remained firmly entwined with hers. Lydia responded with a warmth that made his heart race, her free hand coming to rest against his chest. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Lucas knew with certainty that his life had turned a corner. The grief would always be there, a shadow in his heart for Sarah and Emma. But alongside it now grew something new and hopeful, his feelings for this remarkable woman who had entered his life so unexpectedly. I should probably get you back to town before dark, he said reluctantly, noting the fading light outside. Lydia nodded, though she made no move to release his hand. Yes, I suppose that would be proper. A smile tugged at Lucas's lips. Since when have you been concerned with propriety, Miss Dawson? Since I realized I have a reputation to maintain, she replied with mock seriousness. The schoolchildren are quite scandalized enough by my habit of wearing trousers when I ride. Lucas laughed, the sound still slightly unfamiliar but increasingly natural. Heaven forbid we add to the scandal. They rode back to town side by side, their horses matching pace through the twilight. The air between them had changed, charged now with possibility and unspoken feelings. At her door, their goodbye was sealed with another kiss, brief but full of promise. Sunday, Lydia asked, her eyes bright in the gathering darkness. Sunday, Lucas confirmed. I'll be waiting. As winter settled over Wyoming territory, Lucas and Lydia's relationship deepened. They still visited Emma's grave together each Sunday, but their conversations had expanded far beyond shared grief to encompass dreams for the future. Lucas found himself looking at his ranch with new eyes, seeing possibilities he had forgotten to imagine. The first heavy snow came in early December, making travel between the ranch and town increasingly difficult. Lucas worried about Lydia attempting the ride alone and began meeting her halfway, ensuring she arrived safely at the ranch and returned home before darkness fell. One Sunday, a blizzard descended without warning while they were visiting Emma's grave. By the time they reached the ranch house, the world had disappeared behind a curtain of white. You can't possibly ride back in this, Lucas said, helping Lydia remove her snow-covered coat. It's not safe. Perhaps it will let up soon, Lydia suggested, though they both knew the likelihood was slim. Lucas stoked the fire, trying to bring warmth back to the room while Lydia rubbed her cold hands together. You'll have to stay here tonight, he said finally. I can sleep in the spare room. You can take my bedroom. Lydia's cheeks colored slightly. People will talk. People already talk, Lucas pointed out, but I'd rather face gossip than risk your safety. Lydia couldn't argue with that logic. What about school tomorrow? If this keeps up, no one will be expecting the schoolhouse to open, Lucas assured her. Even Mrs. Thompson won't expect you to risk your neck for the sake of arithmetic lessons. As the evening progressed and the storm showed no signs of abating, they settled into a domestic routine that felt surprisingly natural. Lydia helped prepare dinner, moving around his kitchen with easy confidence. They ate by firelight, talking and laughing as the wind howled outside. Later, as Lucas showed Lydia to his bedroom, an awkward silence fell between them. I can lend you a shirt to sleep in, he offered. Thank you, Lydia said, her voice softer than usual. And thank you for insisting I stay. It was the sensible decision. That's me, Lucas said with a small smile. Sensible to the core. Lydia laughed, the sound brightening the dimly lit hallway. Then, standing on tiptoe, she pressed a quick kiss to his lips. Good night, Lucas. Good night, Lydia, he replied, watching as she disappeared into his room. Sleep eluded Lucas that night, despite the comfortable enough spare bed. The knowledge that Lydia was under his roof, sleeping in his bed, filled him with emotions he could scarcely name. Not just desire, though that was certainly present, but a deeper yearning for permanence, for a future where such arrangements weren't temporary necessities, but their chosen life. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the world transformed under a blanket of pristine snow. Lucas rose early, as was his habit, and found Lydia already in the kitchen, preparing coffee. Good morning, she said, looking remarkably put together despite having slept in borrowed clothes. I hope you don't mind me making myself at home. I don't mind at all, Lucas said honestly. The sight of her in his kitchen, comfortable and domestic, stirred something profound in him. In fact, it looks right you being here. Lydia's hands stilled on the coffee pot. Does it? Lucas took a deep breath, deciding that honesty was the only path forward. Yes, these past months with you have been... I never expected to feel this way again, Lydia, to want a future with someone. After losing Sarah and Emma, I thought that part of my life was over. Lydia turned to face him fully, her expression open and vulnerable. And now? Now I find myself imagining a life with you, Lucas said simply. If that's something you might want too. Lydia crossed the kitchen to stand before him, reaching up to touch his face gently. I came west seeking independence and purpose, she said. I never imagined finding love as well. But here you are. And I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore. Lucas covered her hand with his own. Is that a yes? To what? Lydia asked, a smile playing at her lips. You haven't actually asked me anything, Lucas Everett. Lucas laughed, then sobered, taking both her hands in his. Lydia Dawson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of building a life with me on this ranch? It won't always be easy, but I promise to cherish you, to respect your independence, and to love you for all the days of my life. Tears shone in Lydia's eyes, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. Their kiss sealed the promise, tender at first, then deepening with the knowledge that this was no longer temporary, that they had chosen each other, chosen a future together. When they finally parted, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. I should probably get you back to town, he said reluctantly, before your reputation is entirely beyond saving. Lydia laughed. A day's absence during a blizzard is perfectly reasonable. Besides, I think Mrs. Thompson will forgive any impropriety once she learns her matchmaking has finally succeeded, albeit indirectly. The snow-covered trail into town was passable enough, though they rode slowly, savoring these first hours of their engagement. At the edge of town, Lucas reluctantly relinquished Lydia to her duties, with a promise to call on her properly that evening to discuss their plans. News of their engagement spread through Whispering Pines with predictable speed. By the time Lucas returned that evening, Lydia had already fielded congratulations from half the town, including a tearfully approving Mrs. Thompson. "She's already planning the wedding," Lydia informed him with amusement as they sat in her landlady's parlor. "June apparently is the only acceptable month." Lucas took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "And what do you think? Does June suit you?" Lydia considered this. "June is lovely, but it's 6 months away. That's a very long engagement." "Too long?" Lucas asked, his heart quickening at her implication. "Perhaps," Lydia admitted. "The school term ends in 3 weeks before Christmas. I was thinking perhaps the new year might be nice for a fresh beginning." Lucas couldn't contain his smile. "The new year sounds perfect." They were married on January the 1st, 1877, in the small church in Whispering Pines. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by the townsfolk who had come to care for both the quiet rancher and their determined schoolteacher. Lydia wore a dress of deep blue rather than traditional white, with cornflowers in her hair in remembrance of Emma. Lucas stood tall and proud beside her, his voice strong and sure as he spoke his vows. Before they left for the ranch that evening, they stopped at the cemetery on the hill, laying a bouquet on Emma's grave and one on Sarah's as well. "I think they would be happy for us," Lydia said softly as they stood hand in hand before the graves. "I know they would," Lucas replied. "Sarah always wanted me to be happy above all else. And Emma," his voice caught briefly, "Emma adored you from the first day of school." "I like to think she brought us together somehow," Lydia admitted. "That day I found you at her grave. I'd been visiting for months, but never when you were there. Then suddenly, there you were." Lucas squeezed her hand. Maybe she did. As they rode toward the ranch, their ranch now, Lucas felt a sense of rightness settle over him. The grief would always be there, a part of him that honored what he had lost. But alongside it now grew something equally powerful, love, renewed and reimagined with this remarkable woman who had found her way into his broken heart and helped make it whole again. That night, as they stood together on the porch of the ranch house, looking out at the star-filled sky above their land, Lucas wrapped his arms around his wife and whispered, "Welcome home, Lydia Everett." Lydia leaned back against his chest, her hands covering his where they rested at her waist. "Home," she repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." As the new year unfolded, Lucas and Lydia settled into married life with a naturalness that surprised them both. Lydia completed the school term, then made the difficult decision to resign her position to focus on the ranch. "Are you sure?" Lucas had asked when she first proposed the idea. "I know how much teaching means to you." "The ranch needs attention if we're going to expand, as we've discussed," Lydia had replied practically. "Besides, I can still teach. There are children on neighboring ranches who can't make it to town regularly. Perhaps we could host lessons here once or twice a week." Lucas marveled at her ability to envision possibilities he hadn't considered. "You're remarkable, you know that?" By spring, Lydia had established a small schoolroom in one of the unused bedrooms at the ranch house, where she taught the children of ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders twice weekly. The arrangement allowed her to contribute her skills while still participating fully in the running of the ranch, which thrived under their combined care. They visited Emma's grave together each Sunday without fail, watching as the seasons changed around the small cemetery on the hill. Sometimes they spoke to her, telling her about new calves or Lydia's students or plans for the ranch. Other times they simply sat in peaceful silence, grateful for the child who had, in her own way, brought them together. As summer approached, Lydia began to suspect a change in her condition. She waited until she was certain before sharing the news with Lucas one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Lucas," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, I have something to tell you." He turned to her, concern immediately crossing his features. "Is everything all right?" Lydia took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "Everything is perfect. We're going to have a baby, come winter." Lucas stared at her for a long moment, joy and fear battling visibly on his face. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you sure?" Lydia nodded. "Dr. Bennett confirmed it yesterday when I was in town." Lucas pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that spoke volumes. "I'm scared," he admitted against her hair. "After Emma." "I know," Lydia said softly. "I'm scared too. But this is our chance to build on what we found together, to honor Sarah and Emma by moving forward with love and hope." Lucas drew back slightly to look at her face. "When did you get so wise?" he asked, not for the first time. "I had a good teacher," Lydia replied with a small smile. "A certain rancher who taught me that grief and joy can exist side by side, that one doesn't diminish the other." The months that followed were filled with preparations and anticipation. Lucas insisted on hiring more help for the ranch so that Lydia could rest when needed, though she remained active well into her pregnancy, continuing her twice-weekly lessons and helping with the lighter ranch tasks. They converted the room next to theirs into a nursery, Lucas crafting a cradle from wood harvested on their own land. Lydia sewed blankets and tiny garments, sometimes sitting by Emma's grave as she worked, finding comfort in the connection. As winter approached, bringing with it shorter days and the promise of snow, Lucas found himself increasingly anxious. The memory of losing Sarah and Emma loomed large, especially as Lydia's time grew near. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lydia caught him watching her with worry etched into his features. "What is it?" she asked gently, setting aside her sewing. Lucas hesitated, then admitted, "I'm terrified of losing you, both of you." Lydia moved to sit beside him, taking his hand and placing it on her rounded belly where their child kicked vigorously. "Feel that? That's our future, Lucas. Strong and determined, just like its parents." "I couldn't bear it if—" "Don't," Lydia interrupted. "We can't live in fear of what might happen. We can only move forward with faith and hope." Lucas pressed his forehead to hers. "How did I get so fortunate to find you?" "I believe a certain 8-year-old had something to do with it," Lydia said with a soft smile. On a clear, cold December morning, their son entered the world after a night of labor that tested both Lydia's strength and Lucas's resolve. When the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in Lydia's arms, Lucas felt a surge of emotions so powerful he could scarcely breathe. "He's perfect," Lydia whispered, tears streaming down her face as she counted tiny fingers and toes. "Absolutely perfect." Lucas sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around his wife, the other gently touching his son's downy head. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names but made no final decision, both feeling that they would know the right name when they met their child. Lydia looked down at their son, then up at Lucas. "I was thinking perhaps William, after your father. William Lucas Everett." Lucas nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "It's a good name. A strong name." "And for a middle name," Lydia continued hesitantly, "I thought perhaps Samuel, after Sarah's father, to honor her." Lucas felt tears prick his eyes at her thoughtfulness. "William Samuel Everett," he said, testing the name. "It's perfect." As the new year of 1878 dawned, the Everett household settled into a new rhythm centered around their infant son. Will, as they called him, thrived under the care of his adoring parents, growing strong despite the winter chill that kept them largely housebound. On the first Sunday that the weather permitted, they bundled Will carefully and took him to the cemetery on the hill. Standing before Emma's grave, Lucas held his son while Lydia arranged fresh evergreen boughs against the stone. "Emma," Lucas said softly, "this is your brother William. Will, this is your big sister Emma. She can't be here with us, but she's watching over you, I promise." Lydia stood beside them, her arm linked through Lucas's, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had found the courage to love again, for the child in his arms, and for the daughter who had brought them together. "She'd be proud of us," Lydia said quietly, "of this family we're building." Lucas looked down at his wife, then at his son, then at the grave of the daughter he had lost. The grief was still there, a shadow in his heart, but it no longer defined him. What defined him now was love for the family he had lost, for the family he had found, and for the future they were building together. "Yes," he agreed, his voice steady and sure. "She would." As they walked back down the hill toward the ranch house, toward home, Lucas felt a sense of peace settle over him. Life had taken him on a journey he could never have imagined, through depths of grief he had thought would consume him. Yet here he was, with his wife beside him and his son in his arms, moving forward into a future bright with possibility. The ranch spread out before them, solid and enduring, a legacy now not just of what had been lost, but of what had been found. In the distance, a rider approached one of their hands, returning from checking the north pasture. Smoke rose from the chimney of the ranch house, promising warmth and welcome. And above it all, the vast Wyoming sky stretched endlessly, a reminder that life, like the land itself, continued on, sometimes harsh, sometimes gentle, always worth the journey. "Home," Lucas said simply, echoing Lydia's words from a year earlier. Lydia smiled up at him, her eyes filled with love. "Home," she agreed as they stepped forward together into the life they had chosen. The life they had built from grief and hope and love, a life that honored the past while embracing the future, one day at a time.